Iran just lit a match next to the world's biggest oil pipeline and called it a military exercise. Here is what actually happened and why every aircraft carrier commander in the Fifth Fleet just sat up a little straighter in their chair. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, the IRGC Navy, basically the regime's personal nautical enforcement squad, just conducted a live fire test of something they are calling the Sayyad 3G. That G stands for naval variant, and it was fired from one of their newest Shahid Soleimani-class corvettes, operating right there in the Strait of Hormuz. Now, a corvette is a warship, not a Chevy, not a midlife crisis. A fast, relatively small combat vessel. Think of it as the military equivalent of a sports car that also happens to carry surface-to-air missiles and a serious attitude problem. Iran is claiming this weapon creates a 93-mile protective air defense dome around whatever ship fires it. 93 miles. That is not nothing. That is the kind of number that makes Pentagon analysts put down their coffee. And the timing here is about as subtle as a flare gun at a gas station. President Trump has handed Tehran somewhere between a 10 and 15-day window to show up to nuclear negotiations like adults or face consequences that the administration has described as severe. In response, Iran has done two things: paraded their new missile hardware in front of every camera they own, and quietly instructed Supreme Leader Khamenei's inner circle to have a succession plan ready in case things go sideways fast. That last part is not a rumor. That is reported fact. Khamenei has reportedly designated Ali Larijani and a cluster of senior political and military figures to maintain regime continuity if the United States launches strikes. Meanwhile, on the streets and college campuses of Tehran and beyond, fresh protests are erupting. Students are chanting against the regime openly. The Iranian people, the actual population, not the IRGC hardliners, are pushing back hard. So you have this surreal split-screen situation right now where the regime is wargaming survival scenarios in bunkers while its own citizens are outside screaming for change. That context matters enormously if you want to understand whether Iran's military posturing is strength or desperation theater. And on the American side, Washington has not exactly been sitting on its hands either. Two carrier strike groups are now positioned in the region. Stealth fighters have been forward deployed. This is the largest U.S. military concentration near Iran in over 20 years. When you park two nuclear-powered aircraft carriers within striking distance of a country and surround them with destroyers, submarines, and electronic warfare aircraft, that is not a diplomatic hint. That is a diplomatic sledgehammer wrapped in an F-35. So what you have right now is a near-perfect pressure cooker. Iran firing missiles from new ships, the U.S. flooding the zone with its best hardware, nuclear talks stalled, protests inside Iran growing, and a succession plan being quietly activated at the top of the Iranian government. Every one of those ingredients on its own is a headline. Together, they are something much more serious. The question is whether this Sayyad 3G missile test is a genuine military capability that changes the balance of power in the strait, or whether it is the world's most expensive press release. Let us find out. Here is the thing about the Strait of Hormuz that most people understand intellectually, but do not fully feel in their gut. Roughly 20% of all the oil traded globally passes through that narrow channel every single day. It is about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 21 miles. You can drive that in less than 30 minutes on an American interstate. And yet that 21-mile stretch of water is one of the single most strategically vital geographic features on planet Earth. If Iran shuts it down, even temporarily, oil prices spike globally within hours. Allies in Europe and Asia feel immediate economic pain, and the United States finds itself in the middle of a crisis that affects every gas pump from Maine to California. Iran knows this. They have known it for decades. Their entire asymmetric naval strategy, meaning they cannot match the U.S. carrier by carrier or destroyer by destroyer, so they build a different kind of threat, is specifically designed around controlling or denying access to the strait. They are not trying to beat the U.S. Navy in a conventional engagement. That would be like your neighborhood kid challenging LeBron James to a one-on-one and expecting to win on talent. Iran's play is different. They want to make operating in and around the strait so painful, so costly, and so complicated that the U.S. either backs down or pays a very high price for every military action it takes. That strategy is called area denial. The military term is A2AD, which stands for Anti-Access Area Denial. Basically, it means building a web of missiles, mines, fast boats, and air defenses so thick that even a superior force has to think twice before sailing through. Iran has been investing in exactly this kind of capability for years. Coastal missile batteries, underwater mines, drone swarms, submarine-launched torpedoes, and now ship-based vertical launch air defense systems like this Sayyad 3G. Each individual piece might be manageable. The combination of all of them layered together in a confined body of water is genuinely complicated for any military planner to deal with. Now factor in that the U.S. has treaty obligations and economic relationships with every country that depends on Gulf oil exports: Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Iraq, and beyond. If Iran succeeds in disrupting even a portion of that traffic, the diplomatic fallout for Washington extends far beyond just the immediate military confrontation. Allies start asking hard questions, markets destabilize, and the political pressure on any U.S. administration, this one included, becomes enormous very quickly. That is why two carrier strike groups are sitting right outside that strait right now. It is not just about Iran's nuclear program, although that is the stated trigger for the current standoff. It is about the entire architecture of global energy security, American military credibility in the Middle East, and whether a regime in Tehran can successfully use the threat of oil disruption as a shield to protect itself from the consequences of its own nuclear ambitions. The Sayyad 3G test is Iran essentially saying, we have the tools to make your military operation here expensive. Come test that theory if you want. That is the message. Whether the missile can actually deliver on that promise is an entirely different question, and that brings us to the hardware itself. Let us talk about what this missile actually is, what it can realistically do, and whether Iran's hypersonic claims hold any water, or whether they are just the latest episode of what has become a fairly reliable tradition of overstating military capabilities for domestic and international optics. The Sayyad 3G is the sea-launched version of Iran's land-based Sayyad 3 surface-to-air missile system. The land variant was first tested in 2026 with a claimed engagement range of around 75 miles. The naval version, this new 3G, stretches that range claim out to approximately 93 miles by using vertical launch tubes, basically upright missile silos built into the ship's hull, which allow the missile to be fired in any direction quickly without having to point the entire ship. Vertical launch systems are standard on modern U.S. Navy destroyers for exactly this reason. The fact that Iran is putting them on smaller, faster platforms is not nothing. It is a real capability evolution. The ship this was fired from is the Shahid Soleimani-class corvette, a catamaran-style design, twin hulls connected by a platform, which gives it better stability at high speeds and a smaller radar signature than a traditional single-hull vessel. The IRGC Navy wants these corvettes to be fast, hard to detect, and capable of popping up, firing missiles, and disappearing back into the coastal clutter before a targeting solution can be established. Picture a very angry speedboat that graduated from engineering school. That is roughly the concept. Now, Iran is calling this missile hypersonic. Let us pump the brakes on that for exactly 1 second. The technical definition of hypersonic flight is sustained travel at Mach 5 or above, 5 times the speed of sound. Sustained. Not a brief touch and go. Open source assessments of the Sayyad 3G are placing its top speed somewhere between Mach 4.5 and Mach 5.5, with the more conservative estimates landing around Mach 4.5. What that means in plain English is this. The missile might briefly kiss Mach 5 during peak acceleration and then settle back down into the Mach 3 to 4 range for the rest of its flight. Which is fast. Very fast. A Mach 3 missile is absolutely not something you laugh off. It gives air defense systems significantly less reaction time than a subsonic threat. But it is not the same as a true hypersonic weapon with sustained Mach 5 plus flight, advanced maneuvering capability in the terminal phase, and heat-resistant composite materials designed to survive the thermal stress of extended hypersonic travel. True hypersonic weapons, the kind Russia deployed with the Kinjal, China tested with the DF-17 glide vehicle, and the U.S. is developing across multiple programs, have specific characteristics beyond just speed. They maneuver unpredictably in the final approach phase, making intercept calculations dramatically harder. They operate at altitudes and speeds that stress the seams of conventional radar tracking. The Sayyad 3G, based on available assessments, does not appear to incorporate scramjet propulsion or hypersonic glide vehicle technology of that caliber. Iran does have a separate ballistic missile, the Fatah, that reportedly achieves speeds in the Mach 13 to 15 range. That is a genuinely hypersonic platform. The Sayyad 3G is not in that tier. What it does claim, and this part is legitimately notable, is an interception altitude ceiling of around 18 to 19 miles. That is well into the stratosphere. That altitude capability, if accurate, suggests this is not just a short-range point defense weapon. It is designed to reach out and engage high-flying assets, AWACS surveillance planes, Global Hawk reconnaissance drones, potentially even standoff strike aircraft trying to operate at safe altitudes outside of lower-tier Iranian air defenses. Whether it can actually execute that intercept reliably against electronic warfare-equipped U.S. platforms is a completely different question than whether it has the theoretical range and altitude ceiling to try. Here is where we separate Iranian state television talking points from what U.S. military planners are actually putting into their threat assessments right now. Because there is a significant gap between what a country says its missile can do in a press release and what that missile can actually accomplish against a real adversary with electronic warfare, layered air defenses, and decades of operational experience in exactly this kind of threat environment. Start with the Strait of Hormuz geography itself, because it actually does work in Iran's favor for this specific weapon. At its narrowest, the strait compresses ship traffic into a corridor that puts almost everything within range of shore-based and now ship-based Iranian weapons. A 93-mile engagement envelope in open ocean would be impressive but manageable for a U.S. carrier strike group that can simply operate further out. In the confined geometry of the strait itself, 93 miles becomes genuinely problematic. It means any U.S. surface ship transiting the strait is within range of multiple Iranian corvettes potentially positioned throughout the waterway and along the coast. Overlapping bubbles of coverage from several of these corvettes creates a layered defensive zone that is much harder to suppress than a single battery. The Iranian concept here is clear and actually somewhat tactically coherent. Deploy enough of these corvettes that their coverage zones overlap, creating a multi-layered air defense umbrella over the strait. If the U.S. wants to run airstrikes against Iranian facilities, nuclear sites, missile batteries, command infrastructure, any aircraft package flying low enough to use precision munitions effectively runs through this coverage zone. Force them to fly higher and further out, and you start burning more fuel, reducing payload, increasing flight time, and complicating mission coordination. Even if you do not shoot down a single American jet, you have made the operation more expensive and more complex. That has military value. But here is where the real world intrudes on the theory. The United States has spent the better part of 3 decades building and refining capabilities specifically designed to suppress exactly this kind of integrated air defense network. Electronic warfare aircraft like the EA-18G Growler exist for one primary purpose: to flood an adversary's radar systems with jamming signals, blind their targeting solutions, and create windows for strike packages to operate with dramatically reduced risk. The moment Iran's Corvette radar lights up to begin tracking an American asset, it has also announced its own position to every passive detection system in the area. And the U.S. has a lot of those. Additionally, U.S. carrier strike groups carry the Standard Missile family, specifically the SM-6, which is designed to engage exactly the kind of fast-moving surface-to-air threats that the Sayyad 3G represents. Aegis combat systems can simultaneously track and engage dozens of inbound threats at multiple altitude bands. The picture Iran is trying to paint, of U.S. strike aircraft helpless against their new ship-based air defense network, does not hold up cleanly against the actual capabilities arrayed against them. What Iran does have is the ability to complicate, slow, and impose costs. What they do not have is the ability to deny. There is an important difference. The corvettes themselves are also a vulnerability. Catamaran hull designs optimized for speed and stealth are not heavily armored. A joint air-to-surface standoff missile, a JASSM, fired from an F-15E or B-2 from outside the Sayyad 3G's engagement range can reach out and eliminate one of these corvettes before it ever gets a targeting solution. The calculus Iran is betting on is that the sheer number of corvettes, combined with decoys and mine-laying operations, creates enough confusion and cost that the U.S. hesitates. It is a volume play. They are not counting on any single corvette surviving. They are counting on the collective chaos being too expensive to manage quickly. Whether that bet pays off depends entirely on what level of force the U.S. is willing to bring, and how fast. Pull back to the wider strategic picture for a moment because the Sayyad 3G test does not exist in isolation. It is one move in a much larger chess match that is moving faster than most people realize. Iran is simultaneously managing nuclear negotiations it seems to have no intention of concluding favorably, preparing regime succession protocols, attempting to demonstrate military relevance to its own population and the broader region, and trying to sustain enough international pressure to prevent the U.S. from moving to the military option without serious second-guessing from European and Asian partners. The succession planning piece specifically is worth dwelling on. When a supreme leader instructs his inner circle to prepare for government continuity in the event of his death or incapacitation during wartime, that is not standard administrative caution. That is a regime calculating that the probability of a U.S. or U.S.-Israeli strike has crossed some internal threshold. You do not draft a line of succession unless you think you might need it. And that calculation inside Tehran tells you something important. The regime itself believes the current trajectory leads somewhere violent. The Trump administration's maximum pressure approach, surging military assets, setting hard deadlines, using financial sanctions as a chokehold, is designed to force exactly this kind of internal stress fracture. The theory is that enough external pressure combined with internal popular unrest creates the conditions where either the regime negotiates from a position of genuine weakness or it fractures from within. The protests happening right now on Iranian university campuses are not irrelevant to this calculation. They represent a population that is exhausted, economically squeezed, and increasingly willing to be visible about its opposition to a government that has failed it for decades. The distinction between the IRGC and the regular Iranian military is particularly important here. The IRGC is ideologically hardened. It is the regime's Praetorian Guard, self-selected for loyalty and radicalization. The regular Iranian army is a different institution. Career military professionals who swore loyalty to a state, not exclusively to a revolutionary ideology. Whether significant figures within that institution see the current trajectory as a dead end is a question with enormous consequences. If cracks form there, if senior military figures begin considering what a post-regime transition looks like, the entire strategic picture shifts. Exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi continues to accumulate international visibility as the most credible alternative governance figure for a transitional Iran. His background, including as a trained fighter pilot, which automatically makes him interesting to a channel like this one, combined with genuine grassroots support inside Iran and significant diaspora momentum, makes him a figure that U.S. and European policymakers are increasingly taking seriously as a potential partner for a democratic transition scenario, rather than the chaos vacuum that regime collapse without succession planning would create. For the U.S. military response in the near term, expect continued carrier presence, sustained ISR, intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance, meaning drones and satellites watching everything that moves, aggressive Growler jamming patrols to map and probe Iranian radar networks, and pre-positioning of JASSM-equipped aircraft at forward bases. The U.S. is not going to sail a destroyer directly into Sayyad 3G range for fun. It is going to methodically identify every Iranian corvette, every coastal battery, every radar node, and build a comprehensive strike package that could be executed on very short notice. That package is probably already built. The decision to execute it is the only variable remaining. So here is the honest bottom line after cutting through all the Iranian state media claims and all the geopolitical noise. The Sayyad 3G is a real capability upgrade. It is not revolutionary. It is not the game-ending superweapon that Tehran's press releases want you to believe it is. But it is a meaningful step forward in Iran's ability to layer naval air defenses across the Strait of Hormuz, and dismissing it entirely would be the kind of analytical arrogance that gets people killed. The geography of the strait makes even an imperfect weapon potentially useful. A missile that only intercepts 30% of what it is aimed at is still a serious problem if there are 20 of them firing simultaneously at your strike package. What this missile is not, despite the headlines, is hypersonic in any technically rigorous sense. Mach 4.5 to 5.5 peak speed with no confirmed sustained hypersonic flight capability, no advanced maneuvering in the terminal phase, and no confirmed use of scramjet propulsion puts this in the very fast surface-to-air missile category, rather than the true hypersonic weapon category. That distinction matters for how the U.S. calibrates its electronic warfare and intercept responses. Iran's Fateh ballistic missile is the actual hypersonic concern. The Syad 3G is a real tactical headache, not a strategic earthquake. The broader picture is actually more alarming than any individual missile system. A regime that is preparing succession protocols while simultaneously test-firing naval weapons in waters where two American carrier strike groups are sitting is a regime that has decided to see how far this goes. That is not a posture of a government preparing to sign a meaningful nuclear deal. That is a posture of a government calculating survival odds and trying to project enough strength to either deter a strike or make a strike costly enough that Washington blinks first. Based on the scale of U.S. military positioning right now, Washington does not appear to be blinking. Whether this ends in limited surgical strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, a broader naval confrontation in the Strait, or a last-minute diplomatic breakthrough that nobody currently sees coming, any of those outcomes is possible over the next several weeks. The one outcome that seems least likely is a comfortable return to the status quo where nothing happens and everyone goes home. The pressure has been building too long. The military postures on both sides are too advanced. The internal Iranian situation is too unstable. If strikes do come, watch the corvettes. They will be early targets precisely because their radar systems are central to Iran's area denial network. Take out the targeting radars, and the Syad 3G becomes a very expensive piece of junk fired blindly at targets it cannot find. That is the logic of electronic warfare and precision strike working together. You do not have to outrun a missile if you make sure it never gets a good targeting solution in the first place. So that is where we are. Iran has a new naval missile they are very proud of. The U.S. has 2 aircraft carriers, stealth fighters, and electronic warfare aircraft that have been thinking about exactly this threat for years. The Strait of Hormuz is the most important waterway in the world, and it is about to find out which side of this equation is right. Now, the question everyone is dancing around. Does the Syad 3G actually change the military math enough that it gives Iran a genuine deterrent? Or does it just give Tehran better propaganda footage while the U.S. strike packages are already being finalized? Drop your honest read in the comments. And if you want the next breakdown the moment this situation moves, because it is going to move, hit subscribe so you are not reading about it on someone else's feed 12 hours after it happens. The next video is already queued up, and it is going to connect some dots that most people are missing entirely.